Hello, thanks for joining me. In this video, I'm working on this 2007 Ford Ranger. So it's a Ford Ranger 2.5 TDCi, double cab, four-wheel drive. The job for this video is to do something about the sloppy steering. These vehicles have a steering box rather than a steering rack. And a feature of that and of the way the steering is designed is that you have a little bit of free play, backlash, slop, whatever you want to call it, particularly when the steering wheel is in the straight position. It's MOT time for this Ranger, and last year when I took it for an MOT, the tester commented, you're probably going to need a new steering box next year, and obviously next year is now. I really don't want to fit a new steering box unless I absolutely have to, and I think I can probably sort this out by adjusting the slack. So what we're going to do here, obviously this is a Ford Ranger, this will also apply to a Mazda BT50 because in case you don't know, they're essentially the same vehicle barring the looks. The factory manual states a free play of 0 to 30 millimeters. I've measured this one already, but I'll show you what I'm doing to measure it. It's just a little bit more than that. So we're going to move some things out of the way so we can get to the steering box and adjust the slack. But before I do that, I'm going to get underneath, remove the undertrays so I can have a proper look at all the steering joints, because there's absolutely no point trying to adjust out the slack on the steering box if you've got loose wobbling ball joints. I don't think there are any sort of worn out or damaged ball joints, but it's worth checking first. So undertrays off, have a really good look around underneath. You can kind of see everything without taking the undertrays off, but it just makes it a bit easier to see if you do take them off. And then remove the stuff out of the way to get to the steering box and try and adjust it. Okay, let's start by taking the undertray off. These are 14 millimeter. The undertray is in two parts, and the bolts in the middle are slotted, or the holes in the tray are slotted, so you can just loosen them. They've got really big washers on. The front bit comes off first. You actually leave those middle bolts in throughout, no need to take them out at all. Right, so before you embark on trying to adjust the play out of your steering by adjusting the steering box, it might be a good idea to check that the various joints in your steering system aren't damaged. There are, how many are there? So if you can, get an assistant to wiggle the steering wheel whilst you're underneath looking for play, because if there's play in these, you need to fix that before you go about adjusting the steering box. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean about the slop, backlash, slack in the steering. Well, essentially, I guess that's the first part of what I mean. So when I'm turning that, there's kind of two levels of resistance that you feel. There's a resistance where you feel like if you turn any more, you're actually going to start turning the wheels, steering the wheels. And then there's a lighter resistance where you're just basically wobbling the steering wheel from side to side. And that's the backlash, that's the bit that we're trying to adjust. So I've got a suitably sized ruler. I'm going to try and sort of wedge it gently against a piece of bodywork so it doesn't move. Then I'm going to use the stitching line on this lovely real fake leather steering wheel cover and measure the play. Now this isn't ideal because we're taking a linear measurement on a circular object, but it's not bad. So let's say we're at about 8 there, and 4.5. So that's about 30. Somewhere between 30 and 35 millimeters of play, and the maximum play is supposed to be 30, so we've got a little bit of adjustment to do. It's not a precise thing, but unless you have a sort of a spring balance to make sure you're applying exactly the same amount of force. I'd say that's probably about 35 millimeters. So let's try and adjust it. Okay, I wanted to just cut in at this point. I'm making this little bit of video after I've done the job on the Ranger in case it isn't obvious. Anyway, as I was watching that bit of video that you've just watched back, it made me think, well, what does the MOT manual actually say about how much play there can be in the steering? So I thought I'd cut in at this point and tell you. The MOT allows for much more play than the factory workshop manual allows, and I'll just read from the MOT inspection manual now. I recommend you have a look at this. It may sound a little bit dry, but it actually can be quite useful to know the standards against which your car should be, I say should be, assessed. So this is section 2.3 of the MOT inspection manual for cars and passenger vehicles. Steering play. Make sure the road wheels are on the ground and pointing straight ahead. Lightly turn the steering wheel left and right as far as possible without moving the road wheels. Check the amount of free play at the rim of the steering wheel. If power steering is fitted, the engine must be running. That's something I didn't do. Steering wheel free play should not be more than 13mm for rack and pinion steering, or 48mm if there are several joints between the steering wheel and the rack. This isn't rack and pinion steering, but just in the interest of reading the whole thing, I mentioned that bit. So 75mm for non-rack and pinion steering. So actually this Ranger was well within where it should have been before I made the adjustment, although it was outside the factory spec. So I still think it's a good idea to just tighten it up a little bit. These limits are for a standard 380mm diameter steering wheel. The limits should be adjusted up or down accordingly with larger or smaller diameter steering wheels. Play due to wear or maladjustment must not be confused with apparent play due to the construction of the mechanism, such as caused by the deflection of flexible joints or spring compression in external power steering systems. That's kind of what I was talking about at the start of the video. That before you assume that the play in your steering is due to the steering box and therefore can be adjusted, you need to check all the steering and all the suspension joints to make sure there isn't play in those, and make sure that they are not the cause of the play that you're feeling at the steering wheel when you're driving. So I just thought that was useful to put in here while we were talking about the steering play. Let's crack on now with making the adjustments. So on the Ranger, the steering box is basically down there. We've already seen it, you can see it from underneath, but you can't see the bit where you need to adjust it from underneath as far as I can tell. So I'm going to take the battery out. You're going to stay there? No, you're going to stay there. Okay. That needs a socket. Here's a 10mm in case that wasn't obvious. Despite it being a Ford, it's really a Mazda, if that makes any sense. So a Japanese vehicle, so 10mm everywhere. That's not to say that non-Japanese vehicles can't have 10mm everywhere, because they often do. Two more down the side here, these are 12. These feel as if they're going through to somewhere where there has been a lot of water spray from the wheels, because they're not spinning freely at all. No, it's still going. It's got to be nearly out. One battery tray full of muck. Right, I can see where I need to get, but I know I need to get a spanner and a screwdriver on it, and I'm not going to be able to get to it with this bracket. Can you see what on earth I'm talking about? This bracket in place, so I'm going to take that out next. These are 12s as well. Looks like it's slow and steady with the ratchet spanner then. There's not clearance to get a socket in between the power steering lines and this bolt. Just give it a little squirt. Hopefully I'll be able to do the rest of that by hand. If I could actually get my hand to it, I would be able to. Nope. Sure, it'll be fun putting this back in. But we'll worry about that when we get to it. There you go. I decided I'm going to crack this with a breaker bar. I've used a 12-point socket for this one just so I can get a bit more of the correct angle. I just know that if I use the ratchet I'm going to end up whacking my hand on something. I still might. No, that was okay. Right, finally. Sorry if that was a rather painful experience for you to watch. It was certainly a rather painful experience for me to do. One of those things where you're making a video and you say, oh yeah, just take this bracket out, and then you're still at it. However, that has given us exactly the view, the angle, whatever you want to call it, that we need. So with those two brackets out of the way, we can now see what we need to get to, which is this. There is a slotted screw head in that adjustment bolt there, and then the lock nut around the outside as well. They're a little bit mucky, so I'm going to give them a clean up, and then we'll be able to do some adjusting. And I've left the vehicle on the ground for this, rather than lifting it up on axle stands, jack stands, because I want the resistance from the wheels being in contact with the floor, so I can feel the difference and hopefully assess whether the adjustment has made a difference. Obviously this isn't the screwdriver that I'm going to be using to adjust it, but it's good to clear out all the muck. Right, that looks 17-ish to me. And once we've got the paint off it, indeed it is. But of course I can't fit a spanner on it. So what I'm probably going to do is break it loose with a socket and then hold it with the crow's foot wrench spanner just to tighten it up. I want to be able to hold it while I've got the screwdriver on there, so that I don't, so that the adjuster screw doesn't move when you're doing up the locking nut. Before I do any of that, I'm just going to make a little paint mark. There's a reference point for where the adjuster was when I started, so I know how much I've turned it, because we're dealing with quite small adjustments here. It's not like we're going to do a couple of turns. Probably might not even be a quarter of a turn. So I'm just using a socket to loosen this. So I guess this is why it was good to do that mark, because as you undo the lock nut, the adjuster also turns as well. So this way. So this way I can hold the lock nut still and turn the adjuster. That's about roughly 1/8 of a turn, I would say. I'm not going to tighten that fully, but I'll tighten it pretty tight. It needs to be tight because if it's loose, you won't be able to assess whether the adjustments worked or not. Now I'm going to feel the steering. Probably needs a bit more. So that's probably, well, it is, there's no probably about it, that's just over 1/4 of a turn. That's made a substantial difference. I've just measured the play again and it's now about 10mm less than it was. So there still needs to be some play. And the other thing to mention is it's important to do this with the steering in the straight ahead position as well. So there still needs to be a little bit of play. I'm happy with that now, so I'm going to leave it there and I will finish the video off by letting you know how I got on after I've had the MOT. Alright, so I'm back from the MOT with good news. The Ranger passed the MOT, no advisories at all. Again, for those of you watching outside the UK or not familiar with the MOT system, an advisory is something where you pass the test but it's written on the MOT certificate that there's something that might need further attention. And they can be things to ideally get sorted out before they get worse, or if you're selling the car, get them sorted out so that you can demonstrate you have been a diligent owner of the vehicle. So an MOT pass with no advisories is really good news. And that brings this video to a close. So thanks very much for watching. I hope it was helpful for you. If it was, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll look forward to seeing you for the next one. Bye!